The Anbernic RG351MP is an interesting entry to Anbernic's RG line because it's basically an RG351P or M inside of the body of an RG350, which is great when it comes to its ergonomics, but not so much when it comes to its actual usability due to other concessions that were made here. The RG351MP, in my opinion, is not worth the price of admission because it is inferior to the 351M or P in some ways, and that is going to be pretty significant to me. So welcome into my in-depth review of the RG351MP that I've been meaning to talk about for some time. Let's dive right in. For more content, do make sure to subscribe to this channel because we upload fairly often and focus on all sorts of tech products. So do make sure to leave us a like and comment any of your thoughts down below while you're at it. It really helps us with the algorithm. And if you want to support us further, then we've actually got a Patreon open, which offers early access to content and special insight to projects that I'm always working on in case that is something that interests you. So links to everything down below. The exterior design consists of metal. This device is wrapped in this aluminum shell that not only makes this device feel really nice, but also look really nice. It looks and feels premium in just about every way, and the grips around the back also add a lot of much desired comfort. This hands down is one of the most comfortable handhelds from the many pocketable ones out there, and I do prefer this form factor for travel. I went with the black unit, and I do think that I prefer that space gray color from the RG350 instead, but this still looks very nice. They went with a very sleek look that I very much appreciate, and it does look a lot nicer than the RG351M in my opinion. I just prefer the style and comfort of Anbernic's metal bodies, and I have to say that when it comes to the build quality, they definitely nailed it here. This device has the Nintendo layout for the face buttons and dual clickable analog sticks, which do feel like the ones on the Nintendo Switch. The D-pad is great too, as it feels very solid and offers enough feedback to be quite satisfying to use. Now, the shoulder buttons are very clicky, which I do prefer, and these are just as satisfying to press for me. Now on the right, there's going to be a sleep-wake button. On the left, there's a volume rocker. On the bottom, there are going to be two micro SD card slots and a reset button, followed by the speaker grills. And then on top, we have two USB-C ports, one for charging and one for data transfer, along with a headphone jack. And as always, the buttons and ports are very nicely selected, and I appreciate what was done here, especially for the button. And now on to the bad stuff. This device has a 3.5-inch 640 by 480 IPS display, but it does not look good at all, not even for an IPS screen. This device feels like it has that low resolution, and it does look pixelated to me. Not to mention that this screen does not get very bright, and most importantly, the colors on this display seem to lean towards a bluish hue, and it looks bad to me. It's not as noticeable in games though, where this display does look fine and colorful enough, but the menu and the box art for every game feel like they are lacking severely in colors. It might not appear that way on camera, but trust me, in-game it's not really that much better because it's not really as dull, at least. And because of the aspect ratio, everything looks more squished than I'm used to, and that even goes for the UI elements. This is an issue that will carry on throughout this entire review, and especially the gaming section, but most importantly, just one particular emulator. But before that, this device features dual stereo speakers that sound pretty good, and I have to say that in terms of the audio quality, I'm pretty impressed here. They get pretty loud, and while not super clear, these are still pretty good. So go ahead and have a listen. So in terms of specs, this device features an RK3326 chip with a Mali G31 GPU, 1GB of RAM, and a 3500 mAh battery, which is going to be very typical. These are very typical specs for a handheld like this, and it's going to be almost identical to something like the 351M and the P in terms of specs. And as you can see, just from the spec sheet alone, this device won't really have much to offer for the price. So let's get into what I mean when I say this through the gaming test. So let's first begin by talking about emulation performance. Let's discuss the systems that I'm mostly interested in seeing, such as PSP, Dreamcast, PS1, N64, DS, and GBA. Beginning with PSP. This device uses the PPSSPP backend, though the rest of the emulators run on RetroArch. I was actually pretty disappointed to see how this system performed here. PSP will look squished due to this screen's aspect ratio being more squared, and this display also doesn't look very good, but I already touched upon that aspect in the display section. But here, games like Dissidia and Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep run at about 15 frames per second. I tried to tinker with the settings, but everything was already set pretty low, and these games still chugged. Granted, the frame rate was noticeable, but Dissidia still felt playable when Kingdom Hearts did not. I would say that more action-packed games will not be very enjoyable with this device, even on PPSSPP. But if you wanted some less demanding games like Persona 3 Portable, then the frame rate shouldn't really be much of an issue here, even if the image is because of this device's aspect ratio. But also, the colors suck, and Persona 3 oftentimes wouldn't even turn itself on, like it wouldn't even boot. So I guess that won't be an issue because you probably won't be playing Persona 3 anyway. But in terms of performance, I would say that you are better off with the less demanding titles and those that don't depend on a decent frame rate to run too well. Now, I didn't really feel this way about the 351M, and these two have the same specs. But I suppose that the emulator in the 351M is just more optimized. So every other emulator that I test out will be running on the RetroArch backend, which isn't really the best performing way of playing these games, but I understand why they stick to RetroArch, which is for convenience. So Dreamcast isn't really going to be very good, but it is still playable considering that something like Sonic Adventure 2 will run fine for the most part, even if you do get quite a few stutters, especially when it comes to the audio itself. There's going to be quite a bit of crackling, and it's not a very pleasant experience, but I will say that the aspect ratio for the screen works very nicely with the system and almost every other one in this lineup. I would not get this for Dreamcast, but I would get it for almost any other system that I'm just about to mention. PlayStation 1 runs pretty smoothly on this system. I played one of my favorite classics like Mortal Kombat 4, and I had a great time. Gameplay was very smooth and the game looked just as I remember, but on a much smaller screen this time around. So even an action game like this will run very well on an RK3326 chip, which isn't really too surprising, but still nice to see. Same goes for a game that isn't really quite as demanding, but still very beautiful and genuinely a fantastic game, Final Fantasy Tactics. This game has aged very well, and it runs very nicely for the most part, and the frame rate is almost always consistent with some minor dips here and there. There are going to be times where the games are going to begin to chug here for like a split moment and things like that, but it's not distracting enough to really get in the way. So I would say that I'm fairly happy with PlayStation 1 performance on this system. Nintendo 64 was disappointing and somewhat expected, so something like Ocarina of Time is not going to run very well on this device due to the game constantly chugging and stuttering in general. It was not a very pleasant experience because if there was just as much stuttering, or maybe not really quite as bad really as Dreamcast performance, and unfortunately every other game that I tested here did not perform very well, which was disappointing. And I would not consider N64 to be playable on this system, but that's just from my own experience. I'm sure that many people would be willing to deal with some stuttering, and I think it's fine, but not on a device that is as expensive as this one. I understand that the bill of materials is what makes it as expensive as it is, but even then, I don't really think that it's worth considering for this kind of thing. So Nintendo DS, on the other hand, seemed to run actually fairly well. I didn't really test any games that were particularly demanding, but I did still go for some pretty cool DS games. Like Pokemon Mystery Dungeon performed nicely, and I believe that this is because this one is running on the Drastic backend, which is a good move as RetroArch isn't really the best performing backend out there. So I am glad that they went with this method, and I do believe that at least half of the DS library should perform just fine on the system. Now, as always, it's annoying to operate a game that requires touch inputs without a touchscreen, so they offer this cursor instead. I don't love that, but I also don't like the idea of DS emulation on devices that only have a single display anyway, or not enough room to fit both comfortably. So this device, unfortunately, fits that bill, and I would not get this for Nintendo DS either. And lastly, I tested out GBA, but this was definitely going to crush GBA no problem. So yeah, performance in any GBA game will be great and consistent, which is a great thing. It's got the right aspect ratio for the system as well, so I would say that this is probably one of the best ways of playing GBA, but I do wish that it was better tuned, more vibrant. Pokemon games, along with other turn-based games, will run totally fine. It's going to chew right through it, and something more action-packed like Naruto Ninja Console will run totally well as well. I do this test to remind people that even if those higher end systems are difficult to run for a lot of these handhelds, you can still enjoy something that's less demanding and older just fine if you're interested in that kind of thing. But when it comes to battery life on the system, it's not really going to be very good from my experience at least. I would say that you should maybe expect about 4 hours of battery life at best, and this is really depending on what games you're playing, with 4 hours being the best case scenario. I know that I've been pretty harsh on this device, but that's mostly because this device costs $146 with 99 cents from Anbernic's own site directly. This is a very high price tag for a device like this. Something like the Retro Pocket 2, not the 2 Plus, will run most of these emulators better since it's running on Android instead of a Linux variant, but also because you can add whatever emulator you want instead of depending on RetroArch. It's a pain in the ass to set up, but it is better than the experience that you will get on the RG351MP, and this one costs less than $100, with the 2 Plus model costing $100 flat, and performing much better than the 351MP could ever dream of. So sure, you are going to sacrifice the build quality a bit, but as long as you're not abusing your handheld, then you will probably give less of a damn about the build anyway. There are other compromises with the Retro Pocket 2 though, and those are going to be for a different video when I eventually review that. But my point is that Anbernic does not do a good job at justifying the price tag here. This should have had an upgraded chipset, especially since for $50 more you can get a much more powerful RG552, and for $50 less you can still get a more powerful Retro Pocket 2 and even Pocket 2 Plus. So to who would I recommend this device to? Literally only to people who absolutely want this build and the aspect ratio and are still willing to pay this much of a premium for that. But honestly, I don't think that you should get the RG351MP. It's not worth it. So thank you so much for watching this video up until the very end. I am in my room again because it's far too cold in the garage. And yeah, I'm kind of stuck over here for a little bit, but I tried to record my B-roll over there since the lighting is just a lot nicer there. But with that said, thank you so much for watching again. And if you are still interested in getting the 351MP or maybe just any of the other devices that I mentioned instead, links to those are going to be down below. Those are going to be affiliated, by the way, so I would appreciate it if you were to use those. And also, I would love to give a very special thanks to all of our patrons, beginning with the tier 3s, which are going to be Omar, Sada Wazel, and Aaliyah. Thank you so much for all of your support because it really does go a very long way. Now, on to the rest of the patrons, which you should be seeing on screen right now. All of you guys make all of this very possible, and I do appreciate it very, very much. So thank you. There are going to be some pretty important announcements coming up pretty soon, actually, so I do hope that you'll subscribe for that as well, and many more reviews of retro handhelds coming up as well. But with that said, follow me on Twitch and Instagram. Links to those down below. I do stream every now and then, and I post every now and then. So this has been Francisco from Tech Summit. Thank you for watching, and until next time, enjoy.